Welcome to Science Fiction 101, the podcast series where we explore the science fiction field from all angles, covering the past, the present, and the future. We're your hosts. I'm Phil.
And I'm Colin.
And here we are again, with an episode that doesn't have a particular theme, but we've got one or two things to cover this time round. Some follow-ups on previous episodes. First of all, thanks to David, who left us a comment on our Hollow Earth episode, which was a couple of episodes ago. He writes, I very much enjoyed the Hollow Earth discussion. It's been revisited in the films recently. Kong goes down to his true home in the Hollow Earth in Godzilla vs. King Kong. And then, of course, Godzilla goes down to fight him. So thank you, David, for bringing that to our attention. I haven't seen Godzilla vs. King Kong. Have you seen it, Colin?
If it's the most recent one, no.
No, see, we're both out of touch there. I think the last time I saw King Kong was the Peter Jackson King Kong, and that's going back a few years. Mm-hmm. And I can't remember the last Godzilla film I saw. It was probably... There was one in the 90s, I seem to recall.
With Matthew Broderick.
Yeah, that one. So I saw that one, which struck me as a kind of a... Well, I think the very ending of the... one of the Jurassic Park sequels ends with a dinosaur in a city. And that felt more Godzilla-like to me than Godzilla.
I think that's the immediate sequel, and not the third one, where the Doctor came back when they went back to the island to try and recover the dinosaurs.
So the first sequel was The Lost World, which was actually based on a book, wasn't it? It was Michael Crichton's sequel book to Jurassic Park. But I think the third Jurassic Park film was just made up, wasn't it? It's just a movie sequel, yeah. And last episode, of course, we reviewed Chris Hadfield's The Apollo Murders, which, as we expected, has kind of gone on to be a huge bestseller. Not that we're taking any credit for that, of course, but it's all over the place. We weren't the first to review it by any means, but I've seen reviews everywhere since our last episode. Afterwards, I got to thinking about astronauts and the books they have written, and I could only think of two real-life astronauts who have written science fiction books. And I was thinking Chris Hadfield, of course, and William Shatner.
Yes, the tech series.
Yeah, I mean, whether he actually wrote any of those, I seriously doubt. I know some of them were ghostwritten by Ron Goulart, and he has some other book writing credits as well, but they're mostly collaborative. But then, Colin, you reminded me of another real astronaut who'd written a science fiction book.
Yeah, Buzz Aldrin has written a science fiction book called Encounter with Tiberius.
Now, I have a copy of that, but I'd never got past about the first 10 pages. Have you read the whole thing?
I haven't read it at all. It's sitting on a nook waiting to be read.
So we can't really comment on that. I did take a look at it after you pointed it out to me. I took my copy down and had a look. It's a collaborative book. Is it John Barnes?
I don't remember who co-wrote that with him, and I don't have my Nook handy, otherwise I would look it up.
Sure. I'm going to say it was co-authored with John Barnes.
It is John Barnes, according to Google.
Oh, great. There's another astronaut piece of science fiction. If anyone knows of any other astronauts who have written and published science fiction works, let us know, because we'd love to know. And then something else which is very slightly a follow-up on a previous episode. I mentioned in passing one time that I'd never got on with the Chris Nolan film Interstellar. The context in which it came up, I found myself wanting to say Interstellar, but it always got mixed up with Inception as the words were making their way out of my mouth, and I ended up calling it Interception. But since then, I have watched the Blu-ray. Previously, I'd watched the first half hour at best, and I was not impressed. But I forced myself to watch it, piecemeal, I have to say, maybe half an hour a day over a series of days. By the time I got to the end of it, I thought, well, actually, no, this is a pretty good movie. It's flawed, but I finally watched it, and I am convinced by the extras on the Blu-ray that the kind of filmmaking process makes it a very significant science fiction film. The combination of physical visual effects, mechanical set design plus CGI makes it a very distinctive film in the way that it was produced, and that contributes to the look of the film and some of the dramatic values that it has. So I'm happy to give Interstellar a thumbs up, but I really must sit down one day and watch the whole thing all the way through properly, because I think I've been misjudging it based on the first half hour. What do you think of Interstellar, Colin? Have you seen it?
I did. I saw it in the theaters when it first came out. Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed it. But it has certain notes in it that I really like a lot. One is a really strong family connection, where you know that every single time the astronaut has to make a decision, he knows it's going to cost him time with his daughter. And then the daughter's attempt to kind of like follow him and go after him. And those kinds of things really appeal to me as a reader and watcher of science fiction, or really anything else.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the very ending of the film, which I won't spoil for anyone who's not seen it, but the very ending of the film very much is about the father and daughter relationship. And it absolutely is a piece of drama that works, and it's drama that arises from the science fictional premise. So, you know, it is a strong piece in that regard. I was thinking of films that it compares to, and in the past, even though I'd not seen the whole thing, I'd sort of in my mind compared it to Contact, based on the Sagan novel, and 2001: A Space Odyssey. And having seen the whole thing now, I sort of stand by those comparisons. I don't think the ambition of it is quite in the same league as the ambition of 2001, but I think I probably approve of the story more than I do the story of Contact. I think Contact makes a major philosophical misstep in the conclusion, the final act of Contact, where Jodie Foster is forced to admit that science is faith, which it so clearly isn't.
Yeah, we're having international problems with that right now, where people are confusing the two.
Yeah. Something else we've been doing since the last episode is we've been taking a look at a funny little volume called Extraordinary Voyages, which is a collection of short pieces by Steven Paul Leiva. He's a writer and a former animation producer and a former film publicist, and arranged a number of events relating to Ray Bradbury while Bradbury was still alive. So I know Steve from that aspect of his work and his life, but he is a novelist and a short story writer, and he offered to share with us one of his most recent books called Extraordinary Voyages, which consists of a fairly long short story, which is probably a novella or a novelette or something. There's a shorter short story, and then there are various things that relate to the character of that first story. So there's and there's a little bit of autobiographical stuff in there as well. But I was particularly interested in having a look at the science fictional content. So that first story is, I think, called Made in the Moon.
Yes.
Just to give people a taste of what Made in the Moon is, I believe it started out as a play, which Steve staged at the Edinburgh Festival one year, but now he's turned it into prose fiction. And it seems to be a case study of, well, the impression you get is of somebody who's in some kind of asylum and is being examined by these mysterious figures who interrogate him from lots of different angles. What was your impression of it, Colin?
When the story started out, I really identified with the character. Wants to grow up and be an astronaut, and read science fiction and watched science fiction about going to the moon, and that was truly his dream. And as the character grew up and became farther and farther away from that dream, and the decisions that he made to try and further that dream, I kind of lost that identification with him and didn't enjoy the story quite as much from that point onward.
It's quite fragmentary, isn't it, in the way it's told? I mean, it doesn't sort of follow a linear thread. It's got this interrogation at the heart of it, but then it's got these kind of memories and shifting us to different time periods in the character's life and so on. So it's kind of a fragmented piece, which made me think more of the sort of science fiction that was around in the 1970s maybe, or the late 60s, when the new wave came in and people were more experimental in terms of story structures and methods of storytelling and so on.
Definitely. Well, and then the narrator's unreliable. At one point, he answers a question and then confesses that he'd lied about the whole thing.
Yes.
And had actually done something else.
Yes. I think what's the strongest part of it is the kind of connection between I put it as sort of growing up as a science fiction geek, immersed in, rocket ships and stories about Mars and all that sort of thing, as influencing the crucial early development of this character, and then connecting it to kind of an astronaut career, if you like. It's kind of making a connection between the fantasy and the potential reality of somebody having a career in space. Mm-hmm. And then the second major piece of fiction in the book is a story. I've forgotten the actual title of it. I think it's called Cyrano de Bergerac and Baron Munchausen Go to Mars. And if I've mangled the title a little bit, I apologise, but that's certainly what the story is about. That one, actually, I preferred of the two. And it's possibly because I recognised the references in there. I haven't read a huge amount of Cyrano de Bergerac's fiction, but he did write stories such as, I've got one in a book here, he did indeed write a piece called A Voyage to the Moon.
Oh.
Most people know Cyrano de Bergerac as a fictional character, the guy with the big nose, sort of played by Gerard Depardieu, but he was a real person. And I think he died about the age of 36 or something. But posthumously, there were some literary works published, and one of them was A Voyage to the Moon, and I think he did another one. But what Steven Paul Leiva has done is he's taken the real Cyrano, but used him as a fictional character, and he's taken Baron Munchausen, who many people might think is a fictional character, but apparently was real. And he puts the two together, even though they come from slightly different time periods, and they're both tellers of tall tales. And they go off to Mars. And I don't want to spoil it, but although they get there by a totally fantastical method brought about by Munchausen's lying, because that's what Munchausen does, what they find when they get to Mars is the real Mars. The Mars that we know from all of the scientific missions that have been there. So that comes as quite a surprise, because you think when they get to Mars it's going to be this fanciful place, because the whole story so far has been fanciful. But it's a really nice ending. So I appreciated that one, not just for the storytelling, but also for the style of the story and the integration of those two great liars, tellers of tall tales, and very well used in that story, I thought. Did you get to that story?
I did not. But maybe I should go back and give it a read.
Yeah, maybe you should, especially if you're familiar with Baron Munchausen or Cyrano. I think you might find those quite interesting. One of the themes of that story seems to be the importance of imagination and creativity and how that can inspire others to take action. And in that way, it reminded me a little bit of a Ray Bradbury story called The Toynbee Convector, which is about a man who pretends to have travelled into the future, but by telling people what he saw in the future, he actually brings about that very future, because he's so convincing in his extolling of the virtues of this beautiful future world that he's seen. But it turns out he's lying all the time. But the power of a lie, an imaginative work of fiction is a lie, but can be incredibly inspiring and can cause other people to act and to create and so on. Also a little bit reminiscent of, there's something about the Michael Caine character in Interstellar, because I think it turns out that he lies as well in order to get the mission that's at the heart of the film. It's based on a lie, or at least he misled people as to the reason for the mission.
That reminds me of The Postman by David Brin. This idea that he created this false persona where he had worked for the post office and had letters and used that as a way to find food and shelter, and then ended up becoming the postman and doing several other things. It's a good read. The movie not so much, but the book is good. And I'm particularly fond of it because it's set in the Central Oregon Valley in the United States, where I grew up.
So does it have sort of recognizable locations?
My hometown's mentioned, as a matter of fact. And given that there were only 7,000 people in Cottage Grove, that's remarkable.
Fantastic. I still haven't read The Postman. I must get round to it one day. I don't think I'll ever watch the film because I've yet to find a reason for watching it.
Yeah, unless you're a big Kevin Costner fan. Or unless you want to see where adaptations can fall short when they try to become too non-canonical.
So thanks to Steve for sharing that with us.
Yeah, it's different. It's not like the stuff that I tend to read, and it was a good experience to go through.
Now, I think we should continue with our quiz tradition.
All right.
I did share some notes with you before we recorded today, but I left out a quiz idea. So, you're a fan of adapted science fiction, yes?
I am.
So I thought I should test you on your knowledge of stories that have been turned into films. So what I've got here is a number of science fiction properties that became films, but they underwent a change of title. So I'm going to give you either the title of the film and you give me the story, or I'll give you the title of the story and you give me the film. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So we'll start off with film titles. I'll give you the film title and you give me the story title. See if you know these. Charlie was a film based on a story called...
Flowers for Algernon.
Correct. And the author?
Oh, I should know the author. I don't remember.
Daniel Keyes. The next one is... I think everyone knows this one, but just in case... Blade Runner is the film, and it's based on a story called...
Oh, goodness. It's by Philip K. Dick, and it's... Do androids dream of electronic sheep?
Oh, so close. Electric Sheep.
Electric Sheep.
Yeah. I think you've mentioned this one before on the podcast, but I'll test you anyway. Arrival is the name of the film, and it's based on a story called...
The Story of Your Life.
By...
Ken Liu.
No. Ted Chiang.
Ted Chiang.
Yeah.
He just put out a new collection of stories last year too, Exhalation.
Yes. I actually was at a science fiction conference one time where Ted Chiang was reading a story. Well, he's reading several stories, but he was reading from one of his short story collections. And I think that I arrived a bit late to that panel because I'd been in another panel. And I think he was reading Story of Your Life when I arrived in the room. But it wasn't a famous story at that point. It was a fairly new piece.
It's a very interesting take on the concept of time travel in a different way.
Yeah. The next one is The Thing. That's the film. So what's the name of the story that it's based on?
Who Goes There?
Indeed.
By Campbell.
Correct. John W. Campbell. This one might be a bit obscure. The film is called Unidentified Flying Oddball. Do you know the story that is based on?
I don't, which means I will need to add another entry to the spreadsheet that I keep of all adapted science fiction.
Well, you might have it there under a different title. The American title is Unidentified Flying Oddball. The British title is The Spaceman and King Arthur. So do you know it from that?
No.
It's based on A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain.
Yes, that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's one of the entries, it's one of those entries in the database, the spreadsheet, that has so many adaptations I didn't list them all.
Right, yeah. I mainly know that film because it was made in the UK. It stars an American actor, and I think it is an American film, but it was shot in the UK so that they could use sort of real locations like castles and so on.
Yeah, the United States has a surprising lack of castles.
Yeah,
that are old.
What's that about?
Young country. I mentioned being in the central Oregon Valley, the Willamette Valley.
Yeah.
In the town just north of Cottage Grove, where I grew up, a man built a castle.
Oh, very good.
And the year after he finished it, a herd of elk moved into the field in front of it and lived there for several years, to the frustration of many of the hunters in the area because they wanted to hunt those elk, and you can't do that on private property legally.
Unforeseen consequences there. That's fantastic. Now I'm going to turn it round the other way. So I'm going to give you the story title, and you have to give me the name of the film. So the first one, the story is called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, and the film is called...
both films were called Total Recall.
Indeed they were. And the name of the author?
That's also Philip K. Dick.
It is indeed. And the next one, the story is called Make Room, Make Room. And the film is called...
Soylent Green.
Correct. And the author?
Harry Harrison?
Yes. Well done. The next one. Now you should know this one. The story is called The Midwich Cuckoos.
That is not Children of the Corn, because that's the Stephen King story. Mm-hmm. The Midwich Cuckoos was adapted into movie with Christopher Reeve just before he had his tragic accident on horseback.
Could be. When you said Children of the Corn, you had 75% of the answer.
Yeah, it's Children of the... I don't remember.
You just needed to swear because you couldn't remember the last word, and that might have given it to you. Children of the Damned.
Oh, the Damned.
Also, Village of the Damned. I would have given you that because there were two films. Well, there'd been multiple films, but two different titles.
And that's by Wyndham, right?
Yes, John Wyndham, yes. Have you read the book?
No, I haven't yet.
Yes, I think you'll... Well, I think you'll enjoy it. I know you like Day of the Triffids, and it's in a similar vein, perhaps a little bit more domestic and cosy British middle class than Day of the Triffids, but still a very good read. Two more for you. This one I think I mentioned in passing in a previous episode. The story is called The Seventh Victim, and the film was called...
I think that's a case of inflationary language. Isn't that The 10th Victim?
Exactly, yes. And the author?
That one I don't remember.
That one's Robert Sheckley.
That's right.
Yeah. And the last one, the story is called Super Toys Last All Summer Long, and the film is called...
AI.
Correct. And the name of the author?
Brian Aldiss.
Absolutely right, yes. And as usual, I've totally failed to keep count, but you got the vast majority of those, so very well done, without any preparation either. You get the chance to turn the tables on me with a surprise quiz next time, if you wish.
Oh, all right. I'll have to do some digging. I was pretty proud of the colours quiz that we took.
Yeah. I think all the quizzes we've had so far have been pretty good, except for Seth's, what was it? Ray's, Brad's and Berry's quiz. That was just fiendish.
Yeah. He loves trivia and in quizzes and stuff like that.
Anyway, listeners, how did you get on with our quiz? Let us know, please. And if you want us to do more, let us know. And I've said this before, if you want us to stop, let us know as well. But nobody's told us to stop, so we're going to carry on. Now, how about running through some past, present and future, Colin? Have you got any past science fiction that you want to talk about today?
Yes, I have not read a lot of the classic authors. Mm-hmm. So I've done a little bit here and there. I've read some Clarke and some Asimov and a few others. But I think in the period of the 60s and 70s, I have a big gap in my reading. Mm-hmm. And in the other podcast for Take Me to Your Reader, we're going to be covering Needle in a Time Stack by Robert Silverberg. Mm-hmm. And my library had a collection of his that contained that story, so I picked it up and I read the story and I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to see what kind of a movie they try and make from it. And I decided that since I had 15 other stories, I would read them and see what they're like. And I went into it with a fairly smug attitude, saying, I'm 51. I've read a lot of science fiction involving time travel and time loops, and I've watched a lot involving time loops. I was not prepared for his inventiveness and creativity, the side effects of being in a time loop and the consequences that come from having time travel at all, or time travel being extremely available to everyone that can have it. It's really inventive and creative. Like I said, it's worth reading.
And are the stories in the book related to each other?
Only that they're all written by Robert Silverberg, and they all involve time travel, which is a particular favorite of his.
I've read very little Silverberg. I think just a couple of short stories over the years. And one of the things that's put me off reading Silverberg is I'm just conscious that he's got a huge body of work. And that sometimes puts me off, because I'm a completist. I very rarely can read just one thing by a person. I need to read the whole everything they've done. It's the same with music. If I find a piece of music that I like, I'm not happy to just say I like that song. I have to get the album, and I have to get all the albums that came before it. And I just find Silverberg daunting because of the vast amount of material there is. But I have read a few pieces and appreciate the quality of his work.
Yeah. The other thing I didn't understand was just how much science fiction has been published in men's magazines, and that it was a desirable place to sell things to because they paid very well for it and it had a wide readership.
Oh, yes. Two of the writers who I follow, Bradbury and Harlan Ellison, both sort of progressed through that phase. I mean, Bradbury started off in the pulp magazines, moved up to women's magazines and slick magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, but then also when things like Playboy came along, started publishing in there. And as you say, it's the rate of pay was so much greater. There was a time in the 1980s when the publisher of Penthouse branched out and produced Omni magazine. I don't know if you ever saw that. That was a sort of a futurist magazine. It wasn't a men's magazine like Playboy. It was a futurist magazine, and it published science fiction. Very slick, very glossy, beautifully designed magazine, and that had some really good science fiction. I think it ran for about 10 years.
Yeah, I subscribed to Omni in the 80s as a teenager.
Yeah, great. And I don't know if they're still there, but for a while you could get all the back issues online. Whether they're still there or not, I don't know.
Well, hopefully if they're legal, that's okay. But otherwise...
Yeah. I think at the time they were, and then I think somebody bought the title, so they had to take them down. But that was some time ago. Things may have changed. It's interesting you talk about sort of classic authors, because I kind of grew up on the classic authors in the sense that when I first read science fiction, I was kind of working through the canon of the field, guided by the books that James Gunn had put out. And I was thinking about this over the last week as I found myself consulting a couple of autobiographies. And I remember in a previous episode I mentioned a book which contained autobiographical essays by people like Margaret St. Clair. But as I scanned my bookshelves, I realised that I also had a few full autobiographies by sort of classic science fiction writers. So, for example, Isaac Asimov, he actually published 3 autobiographical volumes, which is typical of him because, of course, he published a huge amount of material. I think 2 of them were published during his life, and the third one was a posthumous volume. Mm-hmm. Jack Williamson wrote a book called Wonder's Child, My Life in Science Fiction, which won a Hugo Award. James Gunn published an autobiographical volume called Star Begotten. And Arthur C. Clarke, I'd forgotten this till I did a bit of digging the other day. There are actually 2 sort of autobiographical books about Clarke, as well as a biography written by somebody else. But there's a scientific autobiography, so-called, called Ascent to Orbit, which has his sort of science, not science fiction, but science papers and sort of a history of his scientific background. And then there's Astounding Days, a science fictional autobiography. And all of those I find quite fascinating. What I find most interesting, I mean, I'm acutely aware that autobiographies can be inaccurate, they can be self-serving, they can be distorted by memory, all of that. So I'm not making any great claims for them as accurate representations of the past. But I find it quite fascinating when you pick up something like Jack Williamson's autobiography, which I've got in my hand here. Huh. I just sort of opened it randomly at page 200 and just scanning the page. And he's talking about a period between 1952 and 1955, and there's a lot of name dropping that goes on because of all the people that he knew. So he mentions on this page, in passing, Cyril Kornbluth, Willy Ley, who was a sort of a famous rocket scientist, John W. Campbell, Hugo Gernsback, James Gunn, Clifford Seamack, and that's it from that page. And if I pick another page, he refers to Tony Boucher and Horace Gold, who were magazine editors of the 1950s, and so on and so on. And it's fascinating to see how small a world science fiction used to be in the 1940s, the 1950s, that sort of era. And I think it always has been, because the field as we know it grew out of the pulp magazines, and people would they'd send letters to the editor, and the editors would publish their full address, and that's how people got in contact with each other. They formed groups, they formed conventions, and it's always been a sort of a very small, tight-knit community, even though it's spread across the whole world by now. But reading the autobiography of any of these big names, you see all these other names coming up, and you realise what a sort of small world it really was back in the 40s. So I find those quite fascinating. And if anyone wants a recommendation of a book to read, the Jack Williamson one I think is terrific. And he, as an author, he's perhaps faded away a little bit, because I don't know if he has any great novels in his catalogue. He wrote an enormous number of novels, but whether any of them would be classed as really great, I don't know. But he did write some of the seminal time travel stories as short stories in the early days. So even if you don't know his fiction, it's worth dipping into his autobiography.
I think there's a lot of value in understanding the people whose works you watch and read. Mm-hmm. It gives you an entirely different take on it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I mean, that's why I love physical media, so that, you know, when you buy a DVD or a Blu-ray, you can have extras on there, you can have interviews, you can have background material. And I love all that stuff. And I really hate that we're moving away from physical media to a totally streaming world where those sort of extras don't exist anymore. I think we're losing a lot, and we probably don't appreciate what we had in the sort of the 20 years in which DVD was a major medium, and now it's going away. I find that very sad.
Yeah, one of the things I've enjoyed was the Elizabeth Moss adaptation of The Invisible Man. Because it talked about the mix of physical effects and green screen and CGI that they used, and we came to learn that the one of the actors who becomes invisible, they actually used him to do all the invisible scenes.
So even though you didn't see him, it was him.
It was him, not just some stunt actor replacing him, but it was him himself.
Yeah.
So that physical aspect of it was still present in the film.
I wonder if that was true of Claude Rains in the 1930s Invisible Man. Was it actually him in any of those scenes, or was he just the voice?
I don't know. I think they had to use so many camera effects and physical effects to simulate that he probably really wasn't there most of the time. Moving on to the present. Couple of weeks ago, well, this is the past in that it was a couple of weeks ago, but it's fairly present. Recent past.
Here in the UK, in the city or town of Milton Keynes, fairly recently there opened up a museum which calls itself the National Film and Sci-Fi Museum. Now, as you know, sci-fi makes me twitch. I'd prefer it to be science fiction or SF, but anyway, that's what they've called it. And it's quite an unassuming little museum. It's sort of in a shopping centre, really. And from what I understand, it's based on somebody's collection. So somebody has collected a load of movie props over the years, and they've put them on display. So I went to visit a few weeks after it opened, and I was quite impressed. It's a fairly small place, but and to be honest, it probably took me less than an hour to go round. So it's not a huge display by any means, but it had more things in it than I expected, and more authentic things. So it's got real props from real films. It's got one or two sort of fakes or recreations, but most of them are real. Lots of costumes from TV series and films, mostly well organised, and it covers all sorts of things. Doctor Who, Star Trek, James Bond films I think were represented there. It's faded away in my memory a little bit, but a whole load of stuff, quite a bit of stuff from films that were shot in the UK. So Alien, for example, is represented there. Mm-hmm. So quite a nice museum. Not something I would recommend that people travel to go and see. I drove about an hour and a half to get there. But it's one of those that if you happen to be in the area, it's well worth your time if you're interested in science fiction film. The only downside of it, the only negative I have personally about it, is that they don't allow you to take photos. And I find that annoying in the extreme, because what's the harm? Now, I know probably there's some, people who've donated objects. Maybe there is some commitment to say, well, no, these will not be photographed or something. I don't know. But I just find that very frustrating. You're putting on this grand display for the public, and then you're saying that the public can't take photos. It seems a bit out of touch with reality, because social media could do a lot to promote a place like that.
Exactly. I mean, it's one thing to say that someone will see your pictures and then not want to come. It's another thing to say maybe people will see those pictures and then want to see them themselves, because it's the experience. It's exactly. Being there.
Yeah. Have you got any sort of science fiction museums near you? There's one in Seattle, but that's probably many hours from where you live.
It's about a 4-hour drive, or about a 3.5-hour train ride.
Mm. Have you been?
I have, about 4 or 5 years ago. And I had my picture taken with Robbie the Robot, and we sat in Captain Kirk's chair. And they had a special Star Wars exhibit, or Star Trek exhibit, which was coming through, and had all sorts of artifacts and almost set recreations. So you could walk through the engine room of the Enterprise. And it was very enjoyable. And they let you take pictures.
Yeah. There was a touring exhibition of Star Trek, probably 20 years ago or so. But I remember it came to the UK, and I visited it there, took loads of photos. In fact, I think it was around the time that Star Trek Enterprise had just come on the air. So, you could see recreations of all the sets up to that point, up to and including Enterprise. And somewhere that I went, it was possibly Riverside, California, where I went to a conference. There was a science fiction exhibition, again, as kind of a temporary exhibition, which I went to. So I've seen several over the years, some in the UK, some in the States. Oh, and there used to be a Doctor Who experience in Cardiff, which is where Doctor Who has been made. Modern Doctor Who has been made for the last 20 years or so. That's now closed down, I believe, but that was a great exhibit. And most of these allow you to take photos, and I think you're missing a trick if you don't allow people to take photos.
Well, maybe people from the museum there will listen to our podcast and reconsider their policies.
Yes, maybe they will. Anything from the present for you, Colin?
I have a couple of things. One I got from File 770, which was Journey Planet issue number 58, subtitled "Cancelled Too Soon." which is a list of science fiction television series which were all canceled too early or too soon, according to the opinion of the people that are writing these essays about them. I've only read a few of the essays because I've been very busy. The first one grabbed me right away. I was a big fan of Johnny Quest growing up.
Yeah.
So to hear that it was canceled because they sold the time slot to someone with more money was really surprising. And to know that despite it being made in 1967, it has never been out of syndication.
Wow. I saw that list, and I think Flash Forward was on there.
It is.
Yeah.
Which is adapted.
Absolutely. Robert J. Sawyer, who wrote the novel Flash Forward and also contributed to the writing of the TV series, he wrote a memo while the series was being written, and it's him talking about the difference between the book and the series, and also talking about the sort of the underlying philosophy in sort of terms that a philosopher might use between the different approaches. And it made me think that it was probably the most sophisticated memo that the TV producers had ever received, because, you know, it was talking about Oedipus, it was talking about free will and determinism, it was talking about the idea of how you adapt things from one medium to another. It really shows that if you allow a science fiction writer to contribute to a creative process, they'll bring more than just random ideas. They will bring a wealth of theoretical ideas and thematic ideas and all sorts of things. Anything else on the present?
Yeah, I watched the movie Finch, starring Tom Hanks, and I really enjoyed it. It was deeply moving. It's kind of a post-apocalyptic story about a man with a dog, and the man is dying of UV radiation poisoning because the atmosphere, the ozone layer, has been destroyed on the planet Earth. And he knows he's dying, and so he builds a robot to take care of this dog and imbues it with artificial intelligence.
Sounds like it could be sickly sweet. Does it avoid that?
I'm going to say yes, but that's my opinion.
That's fair enough. It sounds good. I've seen some images from it, but I haven't read anything about it.
Yeah, I'm really curious about the production of it and how it was made, whether I'm looking at an animatronic robot or whether I'm looking at somebody acting, watching Tom Hanks acting against a green screen with a little ball held in front of him to make eye contact.
Is it adapted, by the way, or is it just a movie?
It's just a movie. It was based off a spec script. And It was supposed to come out in 2019 and was delayed due to a global pandemic.
I think I heard about that, that pandemic.
Yeah. It's gotten around, you could say.
It keeps coming back as well.
Yeah.
Any more present things, or shall we move on to the future?
Let's move on to the future. Okay.
I've got two more or less immediate future things. On the 16th of November, which might be before this episode goes out, so I apologise if that happens. I'm giving an online illustrated talk about Ray Bradbury's The Illustrated Man, which is a book which is 70 years old this year. So I'm giving a talk on that. That's part of the University of Wolverhampton's Arts Fest offer. And the following week, on the 24th of November, I'm again online, and I'm on a panel for a book launch. There's a Scottish author called Mark Gallagher who's written a book called Saved from the Fire. And it's a novel, and I haven't finished reading it yet. I'm about a third of the way through. It's partly inspired by Bradbury, although I wouldn't say that it's in the style of Bradbury, but you can see there's some influence there. And it is dedicated to Bradbury, and because of that, I was invited to be on the panel to talk about Bradbury and Bradbury's influence. So that's on the 24th of November. I'll put links to both of these events onto our blog, which is 101sf.blogspot.com. But in any case, both events will be recorded, So I'll be able to share recordings after the event. So if people do miss them, they can catch up online and play them in fast if they want to. Any future things from you, Colin?
I'm very curious to learn the results of this year's Hugos. Seeing what the science fiction community values as the best science fiction written and created during a pandemic.
Mm-hmm. It's been a long time coming, hasn't it?
It has, yeah.
And in fact, Seth has, in his Hugos There podcast feed, he's been doing some episodes where I think the short stories and then the novelettes were reviewed by a panel of readers.
Yeah, and also long form.
Did he do those as well? I only caught the short pieces as well. So again, we should put links to that on our website so that people can have a listen to those. And I think we've mentioned some of the Hugo shortlisted stories in previous episodes, haven't we?
We have.
And we'll certainly do a follow-up once that's taken place and we know the outcome. Any more future items, Colin?
No, I'm keeping things rather close in these days. Brandon Sanderson will be publishing soon. John Scalzi's new work. The Kaiju Preservation Society comes out in 2022. Mm-hmm. I'm still really waiting for a new Mary Robinette Kowal book to come out. But those are distant future things.
Yeah. Well, also in the future will be our next episode. And Colin and I have talked about doing something a little bit different in our next episode. What I've proposed is that we go back 70 years to the year 1951. And because our next episode will be in December, we're going to take a look at the December 1951 issue of Galaxy magazine. Now, Galaxy was a science fiction magazine which in many ways defined the science fiction field of the 1950s, sort of moving on from the technological space travel science fiction of the 1940s. In the 1950s, American science fiction tended to a more psychological turn, a more sociological turn, a more satirical turn, and Galaxy magazine was really at the forefront of that. So we're going to take the December 1951 issue, and what we're aiming to do is read it from cover to cover between now and our next episode, and then we will review it. I'm hoping, and I've said this on a previous episode, I'm hoping that we will find some stuff in there that feels timeless. So I know there is at least one story in there which has stood the test of time and has been reprinted many times since then. So I think we'll see a mixture of stuff that is sort of timeless, but probably some other stuff that feels really dated. But I think that's the fun of looking at these old magazines. Have you ever looked at old pulps, Colin? Or, well, strictly speaking, Galaxy isn't a pulp, but have you ever looked at old science fiction magazines?
Not to hold in my hand or to download copies of. I've read a lot of the old stories. I have several of the golden era of science fiction megapacks, which are author-specific collections.
Yes.
But it's different when you're looking at what would have been published in 1951 or 1957 or 1943.
Yeah, it's seeing things in that original context, which I personally find quite fascinating. And you can never get the total picture, of course, because you don't know precisely what the world was like at the time that magazine came out, but at least to hold it in your hands and, well, in this case we're going to be looking at a PDF, but to have the pages in front of you, to be able to see the advertising material that's there, the editorial material, things like letters to the editor, book reviews, so you'll see a story in a different context to what you get in a science fiction megapack. So hopefully that'll be quite fascinating. So we'll give that a go. And if listeners would like to read along, we'll provide a link to that on our website, which is 101sf.blogspot.com. Are we done, Colin?
I think we are.
I think we probably are as well. So let's say once again, thanks for listening, everyone. And we hope you'll join us next time. We're Phil Nichols and Colin Kuskie. Our theme tune is from purpleplanet.com, Look for the show notes on our website 101sf.blogspot.com, and also find us as Science Fiction 101 on Facebook. And finally, please follow us or subscribe to us on your podcast app. We're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcast, we're on Google Podcasts, we're on Amazon Music, we're on Audible. We're wherever you get your podcasts. So seek us out, and we'll see you next time for our Christmas 1951 issue.